The dusty streets of Silver Creek stretched under the scorching Arizona sun in the summer of 1882, a town carved from the unforgiving desert where dreams came to die as often as they were born. The settlement had sprung up around a modest silver mine, attracting miners, merchants, and those seeking to escape their past in the anonymity of the frontier. Wooden buildings lined the main street, their facades weathered by desert winds and painted with the grit of countless dust storms that rolled through the valley. Eleanor May Whitman stood behind the counter of her late father's general store, her auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun that still managed to catch the afternoon light streaming through the window. At 23, she had inherited more than just the store when consumption claimed her father 6 months prior. She had inherited his debts, his responsibilities, and the unwanted attention of every unmarried man within 50 miles of Silver Creek. The frontier was notoriously short on women, and Eleanor's intelligence and beauty made her a prize that many sought to claim. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, but this one was different from the usual miners and ranch hands who frequented her establishment. The man who stepped inside moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. He wore black leather chaps over dark trousers, a white shirt that somehow remained clean despite the dust outside, and a hat that cast shadows across features that seemed carved from granite. Eleanor felt her breath catch as their eyes met across the store. His gaze was the color of storm clouds, intense and unwavering, yet there was something in them that spoke of loneliness rather than menace. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster worn smooth from years of use, marking him as one of the hired guns that drifted through frontier towns like tumbleweeds. "Mom," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting, his voice carrying the soft drawl of someone who had spent time in Texas. "I'm looking for supplies, trail rations, ammunition, and perhaps some information about the road north to Tucson." Eleanor forced herself to focus on his request, rather than the way his presence seemed to fill the small store with an electric tension. She had served countless men over the years, cowboys and drifters and fortune seekers, but none had affected her quite like this stranger. There was something about him that suggested he was far more dangerous than his polite demeanor indicated, yet she found herself drawn to him rather than frightened. "We have everything you need," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The trail to Tucson is safe enough if you stay on the main road, though Apache bands have been spotted in the mountains to the east." She moved to gather his supplies, acutely aware of his eyes following her movements. As she worked, Eleanor could not help but steal glances at the stranger. His hands were steady and sure as he examined the ammunition she set before him, the hands of someone who knew his business when it came to firearms. Yet when he counted out silver coins to pay for his purchases, she noticed a small leather journal tucked into his vest pocket, suggesting there was more to him than just another gunfighter. "You run this place alone?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes alert to her answer. Eleanor straightened her shoulders with the pride that had kept her going through 6 months of struggle and hardship. "I manage just fine," she said, though they both knew that a woman alone on the frontier faced challenges that men could barely imagine. "My father taught me to handle both the books and the customers before he passed." The stranger nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. "That takes strength," he said simply, and Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the acknowledgement. Most men either pitied her situation or saw it as an opportunity to press unwanted advances. As he prepared to leave, the stranger paused at the door and turned back to her. "Name's Jacob Steele," he said, as if coming to some internal decision. "I may be passing through again if my business up north concludes quickly." Eleanor found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Eleanor Whitman," she replied, then added with more boldness than she usually possessed. "Safe travels. Mr. Steele, Silver Creek will be here when you return." After the door closed behind him, Eleanor stood alone in her store, her heart racing with an excitement she had never experienced before. Through the window, she watched Jacob Steele mount a powerful black horse and ride north toward the mountains, his figure cutting a striking silhouette against the desert landscape. She had called him too handsome to fear, but as she watched him disappear into the heat shimmer of the desert, Eleanor realized that the way he had looked at her had changed something deep inside her heart. 3 days after Jacob Steele's departure, Silver Creek found itself facing trouble of the sort that had become all too common in the Arizona Territory. Eleanor was organizing inventory behind the counter when the sound of approaching horses caught her attention, followed by voices that carried the harsh edge of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Through her window, she watched 6 riders dismount in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon across the street, their dust-covered clothes and worn gun belts marking them as the kind of drifters who brought trouble wherever they rode. The leader of the group, a stocky man with a greying beard and cold eyes, caught sight of Eleanor through her store window and nudged his companions. She had learned to recognize that look over the months since her father's death, the calculating stare of men who saw a woman alone as an opportunity rather than a person deserving of respect. Eleanor quickly moved away from the window, her heart beginning to race as she considered her limited options. Silver Creek's sheriff, Thomas Morrison, was a decent man but well past his prime, and the town's few other law-abiding citizens were either at work in the mine or tending their small ranches outside of town. The local doctor doubled as the undertaker, which said everything about the kind of medical emergencies that arose in their frontier settlement. Eleanor had grown accustomed to relying on herself, but 6 armed men presented odds that even her father's old shotgun, hidden beneath the counter, could not realistically overcome. The bell above her door chimed with unusual force as the bearded man pushed inside without the courtesy of a greeting. His companions remained outside, but their presence was felt through the windows as they lounged against the store's wooden porch, making casual conversation while keeping their eyes on anyone who passed by. Eleanor forced herself to maintain the pleasant shopkeeper's smile that had served her well, even as every instinct screamed danger. "Help you, gentlemen?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady, despite the way her hands trembled slightly behind the counter. The bearded man's smile held no warmth as his eyes swept over the store's interior, cataloguing everything from the cash box to the door that led to Eleanor's living quarters above. "Name's Cutter," he said, his voice gravelly from years of tobacco and whiskey. "My boys and I are passing through, looking for supplies and perhaps some information about a man who might have come this way." Eleanor's pulse quickened at the implication, though she kept her expression neutral. "Silver Creek sees many travelers," she replied carefully. "What kind of information are you seeking?" Cutter stepped closer to the counter, close enough that Eleanor could smell the stale sweat and unwashed clothes that marked men who had been too long on the trail. "Man called Jacob Steele," he said, watching her face closely for any reaction. "Tall fellow, dark hair, rides a black horse, and carries himself like he knows how to use those guns he wears." Eleanor felt her stomach drop, but years of dealing with difficult customers had taught her to school her features. "Doesn't sound familiar," she lied smoothly, moving to arrange some items on the shelf behind her to avoid meeting Cutter's penetrating stare. "Like I said, we see many people passing through on their way to Tucson or the mining camps further north." The silence that followed stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Eleanor could feel Cutter's eyes boring into her back as she continued her busy work, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced through possibilities. She was trapped in her own store with nowhere to run, and the man questioning her clearly did not believe her denial. "Funny thing about lies," Cutter said conversationally, his boots scraping against the wooden floor as he moved closer. "They tend to catch up with folks eventually." His hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that Eleanor was certain was meant to be noticed. "See, we tracked Steele's horse to this very street, and there ain't that many places a man can buy supplies in a town this size." Eleanor turned to face him, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. "I told you I don't know anyone by that name," she repeated, this time allowing some steel to enter her voice. "If you're not here to buy something, perhaps you should move along." Cutter's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Lady, you're in no position to be giving orders," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "My employer has a considerable interest in Mr. Steele's whereabouts, and I'm not inclined to leave empty-handed." His eyes swept over Eleanor in a way that made her skin crawl, and she understood that the threat extended beyond mere information. Just as Cutter reached for her arm across the counter, the distinctive sound of spurs on wooden planks echoed from the porch outside. Through the window, Eleanor glimpsed a familiar black horse tied to the hitching post, and hope flared in her chest like a struck match. Jacob Steele stepped through the doorway with the same fluid grace she remembered, but this time there was something different in his bearing. something that spoke of controlled violence barely held in check. "Afternoon, Miss Whitman," Jacob said pleasantly, though his storm-grey eyes never left Cutter's face. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The tension in Eleanor's general store became thick as desert air before a thunderstorm, with three dangerous men now facing each other in the confined space. Cutter's hand remained poised near his gun, but Jacob Steele's arrival had clearly shifted the balance of power in ways that made the outlaw leader recalculate his options. Outside, Eleanor could see Cutter's 5 companions beginning to take notice of the black horse tied at the hitching post, their casual lounging replaced by the alert postures of men sensing potential trouble. "Well now," Cutter drawled, his eyes moving between Jacob and Eleanor with renewed calculation. "Seems like Silver Creek is a smaller town than I thought." He stepped back from the counter, giving himself room to draw if necessary. But Jacob's reputation had clearly preceded him among the outlaw community. "Jacob Steele, as I live and breathe." Jacob moved deeper into the store with the same controlled grace Eleanor remembered, but now she could see the predatory alertness that marked him as someone far more dangerous than his polite manner suggested. His storm-grey eyes never left Cutter's face, reading the other man's intentions with the skill of someone who had survived countless such confrontations. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows caught the worn handles of his pistols, weapons that Eleanor suddenly realized had likely claimed more lives than she cared to imagine. "Cutter," Jacob acknowledged with a slight nod, his voice carrying the same pleasant tone he had used when greeting Eleanor, though something cold lurked beneath the surface. "Still running with that pack of jackals, I see. Your employer still paying top dollar for other men's blood." Eleanor felt her breath catch as she began to understand that this was no chance meeting between strangers. The way both men spoke suggested a history of conflict, the kind that left bodies in its wake across the frontier territories. She pressed herself against the shelves behind the counter, acutely aware that she had become trapped in the middle of something far beyond a simple store robbery. "Now that depends," Cutter replied, his hand inching closer to his gun despite the casual tone of his voice. "Word is, you've been making inquiries about certain business dealings down in Cochise County, the kind of inquiries that make some very important people nervous." His smile held no warmth as he continued. "My employer has a proposition for you, Steele, one that could prove quite profitable for a man of your particular talents." Jacob's laugh was soft, but completely without humor. "Let me guess," he said, moving slightly to his left in a way that put him between Eleanor and the armed men outside. "Your boss wants me to forget what I learned about those missing cattle shipments and the stage robberies between here and Tucson. Probably offered you a tidy sum to make sure I never make it back to report what I found." The silence that followed stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she realized that Jacob Steele was not just another drifting gunfighter, but someone working to expose the very kind of organized criminal activity that had been plaguing the Arizona Territory for years. The revelation made her see him in an entirely new light, transforming him from a dangerous stranger into someone who risked his life to bring justice to lawless frontier towns like Silver Creek. "You always were too smart for your own good, Steele," Cutter said, his facade of civility finally dropping away to reveal the cold killer beneath. "But 6 against 1 ain't odds that even your reputation can overcome." He glanced meaningfully toward the window where his men waited, their hands now resting openly on their weapons. Eleanor felt her stomach clench with fear, not for herself, but for the man who had somehow become important to her in just 2 brief meetings. 6 seasoned outlaws against 1 man, no matter how skilled, seemed like impossible odds. Yet Jacob appeared completely calm, his breathing steady and his hands relaxed at his sides, despite the lethal threat surrounding him. "Maybe not 6 against 1. A new voice called from the doorway. Sheriff Morrison stepped into the store, his weathered face grim but determined, a shotgun cradled in his arms. Behind him, Eleanor could see 3 more men from the town, miners and shopkeepers, who had armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. "This is Silver Creek, Cutter, and we protect our own here." The old sheriff's intervention seemed to surprise Cutter more than Jacob's presence had. Clearly the outlaw leader had not expected the typically quiet frontier town to rally in support of a stranger. Eleanor felt a surge of pride for her adopted community. These rough men who worked dangerous jobs and faced daily hardships, but who still understood the difference between right and wrong. "Well now," Jacob said quietly, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time since entering the store. Seems like the odds just got a little more interesting. His eyes met Eleanor's across the store, and in that moment she saw not the cold killer she had feared, but a man who valued justice and was willing to risk everything to protect innocent people. The confrontation that followed would be talked about in Silver Creek for years to come, but it lasted less than 30 seconds. The aftermath of gunfire always brought an eerie silence to frontier towns, a moment when the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the desert air and the reality of violence settled over everyone who had witnessed it. Eleanor stood behind her counter, her hands gripping the wooden edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white, staring at the scene that had unfolded in less time than it took to draw a deep breath. 3 of Cutter's men lay motionless in the dust of Silver Creek's main street, while the outlaw leader himself sat propped against the porch post of her store, clutching a wounded shoulder and glaring at Jacob Steele with undisguised hatred. Sheriff Morrison and his makeshift posse stood guard over the surviving outlaws, their weathered faces grim but satisfied with the outcome. The old lawman had proven that age and experience could still triumph over youth and recklessness, his shotgun having accounted for one of the fallen men, while the townspeople had handled themselves with surprising competence. Jacob Steele holstered his smoking pistols with the same fluid motion Eleanor remembered, though she noticed a slight stiffness in his left arm that suggested he had not emerged from the confrontation entirely unscathed. "Doc Patterson is on his way," one of the miners called from across the street, referring to Silver Creek's physician, who doubled as the local undertaker. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the same man would tend to both the wounded and the dead from this afternoon's violence. Eleanor found herself thinking about the arbitrary nature of life and death on the frontier, where a split second could determine whether a man lived to see another sunset or joined the growing collection of wooden markers. In the town cemetery, Jacob approached the counter, where Eleanor still stood frozen, his storm-grey eyes filled with concern as he studied her pale face. "You all right, Miss Whitman?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone she remembered from their first meeting. Up close, she could see the tension lines around his eyes and the way his jaw was set with the aftermath of controlled violence. Eleanor nodded, though she was not entirely certain that was true. The reality of what had just occurred was still settling in her mind like sediment in disturbed water. "I've never seen anything like that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The stories you hear about gunfights never mention how fast it really happens." "Fast is usually the only way to survive," Jacob replied, though there was no pride in his voice, only a weary acceptance of the violence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "I'm sorry you had to witness that." He glanced toward the street where Sheriff Morrison was organizing the cleanup, then back to Eleanor, with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of all the similar scenes he had been part of over the years. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street, where a small group of riders appeared through the heat shimmer of the desert. Eleanor recognized the lead rider as Marshal Williams from the territorial capital, a man whose reputation for bringing order to lawless frontier communities was well known throughout Arizona Territory. His arrival meant that word of the trouble in Silver Creek had already reached higher authorities, probably through the telegraph lines that connected the larger settlements. "Steele," Marshal Williams called as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "Heard you might be having some trouble with Cutter's gang." The marshal was a tall man with prematurely grey hair and the kind of steady bearing that came from years of dealing with the worst elements of frontier society. Jacob stepped out onto the porch to meet the marshal, and Eleanor followed, drawn by curiosity about the conversation that was about to unfold. She had begun to understand that Jacob Steele was far more than just another gunfighter drifting through their town, and the marshal's arrival seemed to confirm her suspicions. "Marshal," Jacob acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Cutter and his boys made their play, but it didn't work out the way they planned." He gestured toward the wounded outlaw leader, who was now being tended to by Doc Patterson with more professional courtesy than personal sympathy. Marshal Williams surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had seen too many similar situations. "The territorial governor will be pleased to hear that Cutter's operation has been shut down," he said, his voice carrying undertones that suggested Jacob's mission had been far more official than Eleanor had realized. "Your report on the cattle rustling and stage robberies gave us exactly what we needed to clean up this part of the territory." Eleanor felt her breath catch as the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. Jacob Steele was not just a hired gun or a bounty hunter. but someone working directly with territorial authorities to bring law and order to the Arizona frontier. The revelation transformed her understanding of everything that had happened, from his initial visit to her store to the deadly confrontation that had just concluded in Silver Creek's dusty street. "There's something else," Jacob said, his eyes meeting Eleanor's for a moment before returning to the marshal. "I've been thinking it might be time to consider a more permanent position, maybe settle down somewhere peaceful." The statement hung in the desert air like a promise, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race with possibilities she had not dared to imagine. Marshal Williams smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Eleanor had seen from the stern lawman. "Silver Creek could use a good sheriff," he observed, glancing meaningfully at Sheriff Morrison, who was clearly past the age where he should be facing down armed outlaws. "Seems like the town has already taken a liking to you." As the sun began to set over the desert mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor stood on her store's porch watching Jacob Steele talk quietly with the territorial marshal. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to believe that her future might hold something more than just surviving from one day to the next. 6 months after the gunfight that ended Cutter's reign of terror, Silver Creek had transformed into the kind of peaceful frontier town that attracted families and legitimate businesses rather than drifters and outlaws. The main street bustled with activity as wagons loaded with supplies rolled through on their way to the growing mining camps in the surrounding mountains, while the sound of hammers and saws announced the construction of new buildings to accommodate the town's expanding population. Eleanor stood on the porch of her general store, now expanded to twice its original size, watching her husband pin the silver star of the town, sheriff, to his vest for the first time. Jacob Steele had accepted the position of Silver Creek's sheriff 2 weeks after Marshal Williams formally offered it to him, though Eleanor suspected the decision had been made the moment he saw her standing behind that counter during Cutter's attempted intimidation. Their courtship had been conducted under the watchful eyes of the entire town, a romance that unfolded with the same steady determination that marked everything Jacob did. The wedding had taken place in the newly completed church, with half the Arizona territory in attendance to witness the union of the fearless lawman and the brave shopkeeper who had helped tame Silver Creek. "You know," Eleanor said, adjusting the star on Jacob's shirt with the familiar intimacy of 6 months of marriage, "I never imagined when I called you too handsome to fear that I would end up married to you." The memory of that first meeting seemed like a lifetime ago, though she could still remember the way her heart had raced when their eyes met across the store. Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his angular features in the way that never failed to make Eleanor's pulse quicken. "I never imagined that a routine investigation would lead me to find something I didn't even know I was looking for," he replied, his arms encircling her waist as they stood together on the porch that had witnessed so much history. "Though I have to admit, your father's shotgun made quite an impression during my first visit to ask for your hand." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street, where a familiar figure dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Marshal Williams had become a regular visitor to Silver Creek, partly for official business, but mostly to check on the couple whose romance had become something of a legend throughout the territory. Today, however, his expression carried the gravity of serious law enforcement matters. "Sheriff Steele," the marshal called, using Jacob's official title with the respect accorded to a man who had proven himself capable of bringing order to a lawless frontier town. "I have a proposition that might interest you and Mrs. Steele." He approached the porch with the measured stride of someone bearing important news, his weathered face showing the slight smile that Eleanor had learned to associate with positive developments. Eleanor felt Jacob's arm tighten slightly around her waist, a protective gesture that had become second nature during their months together. "What kind of proposition, Marshal?" Jacob asked, though his tone suggested he already had some idea of what was coming. "The territorial governor has been impressed with your work here in Silver Creek," Marshal Williams began, his eyes moving between Jacob and Eleanor as he spoke. "Word of how you cleaned up this town and made it safe for decent folks has reached all the way to Prescott." He paused to look around at the bustling street, where children played safely while their mothers conducted business without fear. "The governor is looking for experienced lawmen to help establish order in some of the newer settlements along the Mexican border," the marshal continued. "Places that could use the same kind of transformation you brought to Silver Creek." His gaze settled on Eleanor, acknowledging her role in the town's success. "The position would come with a substantial increase in salary, and the opportunity to help shape the future of Arizona. Territory. Eleanor felt her heart skip as she considered the implications of the marshal's offer. Part of her was thrilled at the prospect of new adventures with Jacob, of helping to bring civilization to other frontier communities that needed what they had accomplished in Silver Creek. Yet another part of her had grown attached to the life they had built here, the store that bore her family's name, and the community that had rallied to protect them during their darkest hour. "It's an attractive offer, Marshall," Jacob said carefully, his eyes meeting Eleanor's as he spoke. "But Silver Creek has become home to us both." He looked out over the street where children played and merchants conducted honest business without fear of outlaws or violence. "There's something to be said for seeing a job through to completion, for being part of a community rather than just passing through it." Marshall Williams nodded with understanding. "I figured you might say that," he said with genuine warmth. "The truth is, what you've accomplished here is exactly what the territory needs more of." He gestured toward the bustling street scene around them. "Silver Creek has become a model for other communities, proof that law and order can triumph over chaos when good people work together." As the sun began to set over the desert mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor stood with her husband on the porch of their expanding business, watching their adopted community settle into another peaceful evening. The general store had grown to include a small restaurant where traveling families could find a decent meal, while the second floor had been converted into comfortable rooms for visitors who brought legitimate business rather than trouble. Jacob's reputation had spread throughout Arizona territory, but rather than attracting more gunfighters seeking to test themselves against the famous Sheriff Steele, it had brought investors and settlers who saw Silver Creek as a place where they could build something lasting. The town now boasted a proper school, a church that served multiple denominations, and a newspaper that carried stories of progress rather than violence. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked as they watched the last light fade from the western sky. "Giving up the wandering life for small-town respectability?" Jacob's answer came without hesitation. "The only thing I regret is all those years I spent looking for something I couldn't name," he said, his arm pulling her closer as the first stars appeared overhead. "Turns out what I was really looking for was standing behind a counter in Silver Creek, calling me too handsome to fear." Eleanor smiled as she remembered that first encounter, the way his storm-grey eyes had seemed to see straight through to her soul. She had been right about him being too handsome to fear, but she had been wrong about one thing. The way he had looked at her that day had not just changed everything, it had been the beginning of everything that truly mattered.